Under a roaring aurora, an old bull moose breaks through thin ice behind a quiet Alaskan cul-de-sac. Panic flares until neighbors sprint with ropes and a plastic canoe. Why doesn't the giant run? Because he chooses to wait. By dawn's edge, a boy's numb hands hold the line, and the wild remembers. Snow squeaked under boots like a quiet metronome, each step a small pulse in the stillness. Porch lights threw soft halos across shoveled paths and fence posts, little islands of amber warmth in a sea of blue. Overhead, the aurora rumbled, a low, living shimmer, dragging slow curtains of green and violet across the Fairbanks sky. The power had flickered a brief blink, then steadied. Heat returned to vent. Clocks exhaled. Tom stepped outside to check the generator, and Evan followed, coat unzipped, breath lifting in pale ropes that unraveled on the air. Across the cul-de-sac, windows glowed ember warm, neighbors moving behind glass, mugs lifted, shadows passing. Farther out, where yard lights failed and willow stems thickened into a rough hedge, the night held its own. The snow out there lay unmarked, a blank sheet, signed only by the cold. From that dark line, a shape emerged, heavy, deliberate, older than any house on the block. An old bull moose paused at the willow edge, torso broad as a door, withers high, a crown of battered antlers splayed like storm-bent branches. Breath fogged from his nostrils and drifted, then dissolved into starlight. He listened. Ears pivoted to the far road's hush, to the faint tick of ice settling on the lake behind the houses, to the small scuff of a boy's boot on a wooden step. He smelled stove smoke and petroleum and the wet iron of willow bark. Hunger tugged him toward browse and easy water. Caution, earned by winters, leaned him back into shadow. Evan felt the distance between porch light and tree line like a drawn thread. Beyond the last fence post, the wild began, no sign, no gate, just a change in temperature, in sound, in what watched from the dark. The night held its breath with him. The bull held still. The sky moved. He stepped off the willow fringe as if into a quiet room, hooves splaying for balance, muzzle low, breath feathering in pale gusts. The backyard lake looked firm, snow crust tamped by wind, a glassy oval dim beneath the powder, yet a darker seam ran from the culvert to the midline like a buried thought. He chose the short path to water and willow shoots. The first hoof held, the second. Weight shifted. A dry ping rose under the crust, then another, a nervous metronome. The cracks spidered outward in an instant. Snow sank with a sigh, then the lake spoke. Ice flexed, snapped, turned on edge. The old bull dropped through with a heave of shoulders and a startled grunt. Slush boiled up. Water clutched his chest. He lunged, antlers sweeping as if they were oars, striking the ice rim and skittering, finding no purchase. The lake took him to the brisket. Forelegs bicycled, hindquarters kicked in arcs. Shards rang like broken plates. At the fence, Evan froze, fingers hooked in chain link, skin sticking to the wire through a wet glove. Instinct shouted backward, curiosity and terror locked his boots. He had never been so close to that much muscle, that much fear. The moose rolled a huge eye toward the houses, no flare of white, no pinned ears. Desperation, not aggression, held there, an animal calculating, the math all ice. He tried to climb, the edge bit back. A serrated lip of ice gashed the foreleg just above the knee, and a dark ribbon unspooled into the water, then diluted into pink. Breath came fast, then faster, then small, a shallow lift, a tremor, steam thinning in the cold. Cold shock hardened the muscles and stole them. Hypothermia crept with polite hands, turning heat to ache, ache to numbness. Tom's voice broke from the porch, Evan's name and a command to step away. The boy did not move. Across the cul-de-sac, curtains blinked. Somewhere a door opened. On the lake, the bull's antlers dipped once, twice, then held above the rim like a drowning crown. Doors thumped open along the cul-de-sac, slippers became boots, and questions arrived in breath-white bursts. "Call Alaska wildlife troopers!" Wait, don't spook him. Can anyone reach from shore? Phones lit palms. A neighbor already spoke to dispatch, voice pitched low, repeating the address, the words, "Thin ice, large moose, still alive." The hold music of winter was the wind over fences and the lake's uneasy ticking. Tom ran for the shed and came back with a coil of polyrope, bright against the snow. "No one steps on the ice," he said, already knotting a loop. Evan heard the order and the fear beneath it. He also felt the rope's promise, a line that could hold a life without breaking the ice that wanted to take it. The backyard gate stood between them and the lake path, latch cold, metal bitten by frost. Tom lifted it. The hinge gave a small, decisive click. Home met wild in that sound. They worked inside the fence line. Tom flung the rope in a flat arc. It slapped the crust and snaked toward the churned circle. "If he hooks it with the shoulder, we can keep him square," Tom said. Evan stepped forward. "I'll hold tension from here." The boy's voice surprised him, steady, already made. Tom glanced at his hands, then at the bank's firm edge, then nodded. "Anchor on the post. No slack. If I say drop, you drop." The moose watched them, ears forward, eyes dark and level. A choice settled over the snow. Act, but carefully. Keep voices low, keep distance, buy time until the professionals arrived. The rope tightened, the gate stayed open, the night and everything in it leaned toward the lake. A neighbor skidded across the shoveled walk with a sun-faded plastic canoe hoisted on one shoulder. Another carried a folded sled with a bungee. The plan assembled itself. The canoe would not carry anyone. It would float as a bumper, a movable ledge to keep the bull from breaking the ice lip with each heave. The sled would serve as a pivot if they managed to roll him toward thicker crust. Evan wrapped the poly rope twice around the porch post and finished with a half hitch, the way his father taught him. He leaned back, gloved hands taking the load, feeling the rope's faint hum through the fibers into his arms. Tom and two neighbors slid the canoe to the edge and angled its bow toward the moose's near shoulder, shuffling in careful inches, knees bent, weight low. No sudden movements, no straight stares, eyes down. Voices kept to weather quiet, steady, careful, quiet. "Easy, big guy," someone breathed, and the bull stilled, head suspended above the rim, nostrils flaring like small bellows. Steam puffed from mouths, animal and human, white against black water. Seconds lengthened, then lengthened again, until each one felt like a century with edges. The lake ticked, the rope creaked, the aurora whispered like distant surf. On a count of 3, they pressed the canoe's hull into the shoulder, not a shove, but a presence, a place to lean. The moose's foreleg found that pressure and slid. The canoe flexed, took the shock, spread it across plastic skin. He blinked at the fence line, eyes catching Evans for a beat. No challenge there, only a plea as honest as hunger. "Hold," Tom said. Evan held, weight in his heels, breath measured. The line sang a thin note between porch and lake, and the night listened. Tire crunch on hardpack, then the soft cough of an engine dimming. A state truck eased to the curb with its strobes off to keep the neighborhood calm. Officer Hale stepped down first, parka hood rimed white, a coil of winch line over one shoulder. Beside him, Riley, a licensed rehabilitator, carried a duffel that clinked with carabiners and unspooled 2 thermal blankets and a pair of headlamps into waiting hands. The air smelled of cold metal and willow bark and the faint, electric tang of the aurora. They read the scene in a single pass. Canoe at the rim, rope to the porch, boy on belay, bull in a broken ring of ice, and traded a look that meant the same thing. No tranquilizer. Thin ice, water, hypothermia. Sedation here could tip a body under. "We stabilize from shore," Riley said, voice a quiet instrument. Hale keyed his radio once to mark arrival, then let it rest against his chest. "Count me as breathing," Hale told a neighbor, pointing to the moose's flank rise. 15 seconds, multiply by 4. He took a safe angle down shore, never straight in front, never square behind, where a kick could arc blind. Eyes stayed on ears, nostrils, the set of the neck. Calm animals can break like glass. Calm people keep them from needing to. Riley knelt at the bank and spoke to Evan without taking her focus off the rope. "You're our anchor. Good. Keep that tension steady, no jerks." To Tom, "We'll make a chest harness, loop under the brisket just behind the forelegs, keep the line off the windpipe. If he surges, you give, then take." She tied a quick bowline, clipped a carabiner, and fed the free end along the canoe's gunnel so the plastic could serve as a sliding bumper. The first attempt failed, the loop kissed the antlers and fell back. No one cursed. The second try glided clean, water-dark rope slipping beneath the sternum. Riley eased the slack until the line drew a soft V under the chest. "Good. Hold." Evan leaned, the porch post hummed. The rope sang a high, quiet note you felt more than heard. Throughout, their talk stayed procedural. Narrow as a beam. 2 inches left. Stop. Breath at 8. Color improving. Ready on 3. The bull did not fight them. He floated, listing, eyes on the people and their careful sound, choosing stillness because stillness saved heat. In that acceptance, the first braid of entrustment took. The lake ticked. The aurora moved. The work went on. Time elongated until it felt like a material the cold could stretch. They worked in cycles. Tension, pause, adjust. Canoe forward a hand's breadth. Angle its bow to keep the shoulders square. Pull so gently the rope only hummed and never snapped taut. With each correction, the old bull's body rotated a few degrees, forelegs inching toward the thicker shelf where the ice held a lower, darker tone. When the angle went wrong, they let it all settle back to floating and began again, patient as tide. Headlamps carved white cones in the snow dust, and crystals lofted from their cuffs and sleeves like a slow storm blown backward. Beyond the cul-de-sac, the aurora flared a hard green, then thinned to milk, then pulsed again, a ceiling that breathed with them. Light from the houses made a warm corridor to the lake's edge. Beyond that, the water was a black mirror rimmed by a jagged halo of ice. The bull's breath made nebulae that blossomed and vanished. Riley warmed electrolyte solution inside her jacket, then slid a glove off long enough to load an oral syringe. She crouched at the safest angle, waited for a lull between efforts, and teased a few centimeters of the tip to the corner of the mouth. "Small sips," she murmured, not to soothe, he was past language, but to keep her own cadence even. She rubbed along the foreleg, firm strokes from past stern toward the heart to push warmth inward. "Caprofill is slow but present," she said for Hale, who logged the numbers in his head. Neighbors rotated like clockwork parts to fend off frostbite. Fresh hands on the canoe, fresh shoulders on the rope, fresh bodies blocking wind where they could without closing space. Evan refused to yield the anchor. The rope traveled from porch post to his hands to the moose and back, and he felt every minor ask through his palms, the sudden, weightless slack of a slip, the tiny surge of a kick, the dull, water-dragged heaviness of a shiver. Tom swapped the boys' wet gloves for dry ones and whispered close, "Steady as breathing." Evan matched his breath to the words and then to the rise of the bull's chest. The moose's eyes stayed on the boy, a dark coin with a dim star of headlamp reflected in it. No roll of white, no wild flare. Waiting lived there. He conserved motion in the way old bodies do when cost matters. No thrash that would waste heat, only a calculation of angle and chance. When the canoe's hull kissed his shoulder, he accepted its pressure and adjusted his foreleg as if it were a root in the river. Micro setbacks reiterated the rules of water and ice. The rope slipped off the sternum. Riley and Tom fed it under again without complaint. The ice lip crumbled into wet knives. The canoe took their place as a temporary rim. A carabiner clicked wrong, and someone corrected the gate with gloved fingers. Nothing loud. Even the failures were subdued, followed by a quiet regroup. Count to 3, reset the angle, begin anew. Hale called the numbers in a low voice that carried only to the people who needed them. Respirations 10 in 15, that's 40. Heart rate still slow. Good. He stood far enough downshore that a panic kick would spend itself into nothing. When a dog barked 2 houses over, he lifted a hand and the owner pulled it inside. When a far freight hooted across the valley, he watched for the ripple of startle that did not come. Cold crept like a careful thief. It nipped at ankles first, then knees, then climbed. Chemical warmers bloomed in mitts. Thermoses appeared and circled. Evan shook his head. Tom touched the straw to his lip anyway, and the boy took 1 sip without loosening his grip. Good, Riley said, not looking away from the chest harness. We're still in this. They found a rhythm that included the animal as a participant, not a problem. Lean the rope until the canoe flexed. Wait for the forelegs to bicycle. Release enough that the body could float higher. Slide the bow half a handspan. Lean again. Each cycle won a palm's width of angle. Each pause returned them all to breathing. The aurora's green deepened once more, and with it the headlamps seemed smaller, more precise, needles stitching a seam between house and lake. Evan rocked his weight back, held, and felt a slow, sure surge answer him from the line. The bull's chest rose and fell like a drum under snow, deliberate, spaced, sovereign. One by one, the people matched that tempo without speaking. Their pulls occurred on the exhale. Their pauses coincided with the inhale. Their adjustments happened in the rest between beats. The night's pulse, the lake's ticking, the rope's thin song. Everything took the rhythm of that broad, living lung and held to it. Blue hour bled into the cul-de-sac like ink thinning in water. The aurora paled to a faint veil. Headlamps dimmed against the growing sky. Frost filmed Evan's scarf and formed tiny halos along the knit, each breath painting them brighter, then fading them to glass. On the lake, the moose's breathing deepened, no longer the frantic pant of shock, but a slow pull that kept its own weather. Steam rose from the shoulders in soft banners and broke on the cold. "Ready on his exhale," Riley said, voice a low wire that joined them. The rope eased, the canoe kissed forward, and they leaned together. Evan, Tom, 2 neighbors at the hull. One smooth heave, not forceful enough to startle, strong enough to matter. The bull's forelegs pedaled once, twice, hooves searching the unseen edge. Then they struck a thick plate, dull and solid. The leg joints locked, the chest lifted, and the bulk of him slid up and over, belly scraping the rim with a wet, grinding sound. The canoe flexed, took the shock, and the ice, bless it, held. He did not bolt. He lay there, one foreleg tucked, the other extended, ribs moving under a rime of frost, eyes half-lidded but watchful. Steam rolled from his hide and drifted low across the ice shelf like ground fog. His ears flicked to small sounds, the click of a carabiner gate, the hush of a glove, then settled. The rope went slack between Evan's hands and the porch post, a quiet, grateful curve. "This is the decision window," Riley said, already moving into the new geometry. Her hands hovered near, but never touched the neck. "Watch for capture myopathy, stiffness, tremor, panting without effort, sudden spike in heart. Hail, downshore, murmured counts. Resp 40, heart still slow, regular." Riley nodded once. "If he tips into panic or goes rigid, we move him now, straight to the trailer, minimal handling, heat, fluids. If he holds, give him minutes, let his blood catch up to the fact that he's out." They waited, not inert, but tuned, eyes on flank, on ears, on the set of the jaw. The bull watched Evan. The boy breathed with him. Dawn advanced another step, and the ice, for once, kept its peace. They unrolled 2 snow tarps from the truck and made a pale runway from the lake edge to the gravel. Powder hissed as Hale and a neighbor tamped the edges with their boots, sealing gaps that might catch a hoof. The folded sled became a pivot plate at the shelf, its slick belly greased with a spray of silicone from someone's garage. "Path first, then body," Riley said. "Keep him facing the thick ice until we turn." Headlamps raked the frost, casting long ribs of shadow across the tarps. The trailer waited with its ramp down, a rectangle of plywood dark against the snow, straw already spread inside, a propane heater set low, so the air would be warmer than the dawn, but not hot enough to shock. The ramp looked like a doorway drawn with a carpenter's square, between cold and care, between water and a chance. Hale walked in wide arcs, never crossing the bull's fore, never collapsing space. When he had to pass near, he showed his shoulder and looked away, a predator refusing to be a predator. Riley stayed at the angle where the bull could see her without needing to move his head. "Easy," she said, not as magic words, but as a metronome for her team. "We'll turn on 3? On the count, the chest harness drew, the sled slid. The canoe nose nudged the shoulder just enough to keep the line. The bull planted one foreleg, then the other, and rose by halves, chest, then hips, a slow, sway-backed climb out of gravity's insistence. Muscles trembled, breath plumes rolled from his nostrils and drifted around his face like soft smoke. He stood, wove once, steadied. "Hold him square," Riley murmured. They pivoted him with inches, not feet, each correction paid for with balance. The ramp loomed. When his antlers tapped the rail, the sound was small, a wooden note, intimate as knuckles on a door. From the foreleg, a scarlet drip fell, dotted the plywood, and spread in starbursts as it froze. He did not balk. He scanned the shadows of the trailer, the straw, the vague shapes of people holding their places. Then the dark coin of his eye found Evan on the bank, the boys still bridged to him by the rope's quiet curve. In that look, there was no command, only a question asked and answered across species. "Will you hold if I go?" Evan nodded once. The bull put one hoof on the ramp, tested the plane, and committed. Wood creaked, straw rustled, breath steamed. Hale swung the gate as soon as the haunches cleared. Riley's hand hovered near the latch and settled home with a metal click that sounded like relief and responsibility at once. "State clinic," she said to Hale. "No guarantees, but a chance." Around them, neighbors exhaled in a chorus. The aurora thinned to milk as dawn pushed up. One threshold passed, the next waited, miles of highway between danger and care. The trailer backed to a roll-up door that breathed warm air when it rose. Inside, the treatment bay glowed under heat lamps, their filaments humming, casting ripples on rubber mats and straw. The cold came off the bull in visible sheets, steam rising from his hide like a low fog. A lane of quiet panels formed a corridor. No prods, no barking orders, just Riley's voice and Hale's space, the same grammar that had carried them off the ice. The bull stepped down, paused, and entered the rectangle of light. A forced air warmer sighed to life. A tech slid a thermal blanket over the shoulders. Another set a warm IV bag in a sleeve to keep it from losing heat. The air changed its smell from willow and lake water to iodine, saline, rubber, straw. The threshold held, he was through. "Vitals as he stands," the vet said, already gloving. Respirations counted at the flank. Heart rate thudded under the stethoscope, slow but present. Rectal temp read low and climbing, cold stress noted. Riley wrote the numbers on a whiteboard in neat rows and circled time. The monitors chimed to life, soft beeps from a clip-on pulse sensor at the ear, a steady graph crawling across a small screen. Tempo quickened, but the room's language stayed procedural. Clip, clean, prep, hold. A catheter slid into the jugular, tape snugged, and warmed fluids began their gravity fall. Lacerations at the foreleg were flushed with sterile saline, the water running thin pink, then clear. A dilute antiseptic followed. A tech palpated along the ribs, eyes on the bull's face for any flinch. Another lifted each hoof to check for cracks and edges softened by the lake. Where bruising threatened, they noted, monitor anti-inflammatories on board. "Minor sedation, low dose," the vet said. "He's earned it." A dart would have been theatre. Instead, a small calculated injection under skin. Eyelids lowered by millimeters, muscle tone eased without dropping him. He swayed, corrected, stood. Entrustment did not dissolve in the chemistry. If anything, it deepened. His eyes tracked hands, not as targets, but as tools he had decided to allow. "Antibiotic," Riley called, and a syringe clicked. "NSAID," the vet answered, and another line entered the whiteboard columns. Electrolytes adjusted. A blood drawer filled vials ruby and dark, one labeled CK lactate for capture myopathy risk, others for counts and organ markers. The printer ticked. Labels curled warm into a tray. The room had the rhythm of a practiced song. Beeps, zips, clicks, a soft shoe scuff. The wet whisper of gauze sliding out of a sleeve. They lifted the foreleg to debride deeper. Minor sedation topped just enough to dull the startle. The bull accepted the pressure and the sting, did not thrash, did not slam the panels. The rope grammar of the lake had become a light grammar. Angles of approach, shadows kept off the eyes, hands that announced themselves by touch, on cloth first, then skin. "Good," Riley said, not praise, but data point. Under the heat lamps, steam thinned. Heart rate steadied, respirations eased from work to maintenance. "Temp coming up," Hale read. He had learned the numbers as if they were coordinates, and now owned them as reassurance. The vet checked the sternal rise, then the tongue color. "We'll monitor 2 hours, then paddock. If labs behave, we're past the worst slope." The bull blinked, slow. His gaze found the rectangle of door where cold once lived, then returned to the human shapes arranging fate. He stood inside the doorway between death and care and understood enough to stay. The beeps kept time. The lamps made day. The work carried him forward. Back home, the cul-de-sac exhaled and went dark. Porch bulbs clicked off one by one until the street lay under a thin drift of starlight. The backyard lake had glazed over again, a pale scar stitched smooth by the cold. From the porch post, the rope lines hung in loose loops, empty veins that no longer carried a pulse. The gate stayed unlatched, frost fur along the hinge, like breath that had settled and decided to remain. Evan stood at the window with his coat still on, watching the black square where the lake began. He imagined headlamps carving cones, the canoe's bow kissing a shoulder, the eye that had looked past everyone to him. The house was quiet, except for the fridge's slow hum and the heat kicking on. In the kitchen, Tom set the rope on the table and coiled it carefully, as if neatness could keep the night from unraveling. He knew what his son was afraid to ask. He said it anyway because truth prevents worse wounds. If he can't stand, or if the bloodwork says the muscles are breaking down, they might end it, Tom said. No euphemisms, no hero stories. They won't let him suffer. Evan nodded, jaw tight. The picture rose in him, needles, beeps, a door that didn't open again, and he swallowed it. He was 12, but he understood the math of mercy even when he hated it. The boy's hands, thawing, tingled with pins as feeling returned. Outside, the glaze took the moon and kept it. Acceptance arrived without ceremony. They had kept their voices low, their distance true, their hands steady. They had made a path and held a line. What came next belonged to heat lamps and numbers, and the quiet skill of people who lived in the seam between wild and human. That seam had held tonight. Before bed, Tom cracked the back door and left it ajar, a sliver of cold edging into the warm. It was not expectation, only respect, a small ritual acknowledging a threshold they could not control. If the night wanted to bring something back, a breath, a sound, a shadow, they had left it a way in. The house dimmed, the lake kept its peace, and the rope, coiled like a sleeping thing, remembered. The paddock sat at the edge of a green belt, spruce in a loose palisade, a swale of willow browse cut fresh each morning. Snow drifted there, but never deep. A windbreak of stacked boards held the worst of it back. Heat lamps were gone. Light came from a thin winter sun and the dull sheen off snow. In that half-wild square, the bull began the work of returning. Dressings came off and on to a quiet schedule. Riley and a tech washed the foreleg with warm saline, dried it, and laced a clean wrap so the edges lay flat. The flesh knitted, scar tissue rose along the seam in a pale rope, then softened to a line. He bore weight with caution, set the hoof, then the next, tested, stood longer each day. When stiffness threatened to bloom, an anti-inflammatory joined the water. When appetite flagged, willow whips and spruce tips answered it with resin and sap. Vitals moved from anxiety to routine, heart steady, respirations even, temperature true. The monitors stayed inside. Here the metronome was breath in white plumes, no longer thin ghosts, but full clouds that hung and then fell as glitter. Capture myopathy never arrived. Enzymes drifted down in the lab book like snowflakes settling. The staff spoke little near him, eyes averted, hands direct. They fed through a chute, cleaned when he shifted away, and never crossed the distance without cause. Wild first was the rule. At midday, he lay on the lee side of a spruce, shoulders rounded, jaw working, steam rising from his coat in a slow, even tide. At dusk, he ghosted along the fence line, pausing where willow branches arced over the rails. Night brought coyotes somewhere far off, and he cocked an ear, then ignored them. Sleep came standing some nights, folded others, hooves scribed into straw. On the seventh day, gait steadied into a 4-beat that belonged to him again. He tested a short trot, stopped of his own accord, and stood with satisfaction, a posture older than the buildings around him. On the 10th, the paddock gate opened to a second pen with deeper brows, and he crossed the threshold without theatrics, as if doors were simply wider spaces between trees. Evan and Tom visited once, at distance and in silence. They stood beyond the outer fence with their hats low and their hands inside their sleeves. The bull lifted his head, found them, held, then recognized, a stillness like a sentence completed, before lowering to feed. Recognition did not beckon him closer, it permitted them to remain. That was enough. The rhythm eased from alarms to slow, steady routines. Morning frost, warm breath, noon feedings, sun like a dull coin, evening shadows, a heavier chest rise in the cold. Where beeps had kept time, lungs did. Where rope had held a life from water, habit held it from harm. The paddock breathed with him until he was ready to leave it behind. Evening arrived on soft feet, the sky drawn thin with a pale aurora veil and a low, worn moon. The trailer reversed, without flashes, tires whispering over packed snow, and came to rest at the mouth of a green belt well away from roads. Spruce shouldered the clearing, black and patient. Breath plumes hung where people gathered at the tree line. Neighbors, Hale, Riley, a few techs, and then shredded in the cold. No one spoke above a murmur. They had learned the night's grammar and kept it. The ramp lowered with a wooden sigh. Straw shifted. Inside, the bull moose filled the rectangle like a piece of the forest mistakenly boxed. He hesitated long enough to listen, to whine threading needles through spruce, to the small shuffle of boots, to his own lungs moving steadily now, and then he stepped down. Hooves met the plank, weight settled, the ramp creaked. He tested the snow, found it honest, and stood regal, crown tilted, a constellation of old scars mapped along his withers, and one new seam pale on the foreleg. He took 3 deliberate strides toward shadow. Then he stopped. The cold caught the steam rising from his nostrils and coiled it back around his muzzle like the smoke of a quiet fire. He turned, not the flinch and bolt of prey, but the full-bodied pivot of a creature with time enough to choose, and angled his face toward the people at the edge. Eyes passed over Hale's steady posture, over Riley's stillness, over the shapes that had made paths and held lines. They came to rest where they had rested before, on the rope buoy. Evan stood half a step forward of Tom, hands empty, shoulders squared by will rather than size. The bull approached, slow enough that everyone held their breath and could hear it. A chorus falling into a single, suspended note. The distance closed to the edge of impossible. Hale did not raise a hand. Riley did not whisper a command. This part was not theirs. Steam rolled warm and white. Evan's body remembered before thought caught up. He lifted his gloved hands and cupped them as if to catch snow, as if to hold a small, breakable thing. The old bull leaned, not to touch, but to bridge a gap with air alone. He exhaled, a long, even breath poured into the boy's hands, heat bleeding through wool, through skin, all the way to a place words do not service. No contact, only shared air, and in it, the sum of a night's work, a neighborhood's patience, a species' brief choosing. It lasted a heartbeat and then one more. Stillness made a room around them. The aurora thinned and brightened in the same moment, like a curtain lifted and lowered. The bull straightened. He turned, with the unargumentative certainty of the wild, and walked into the spruce shadow, his dark back dissolving into black trunks, antlers becoming branches, breath becoming the colds again. Snow took his sound and kept it. They did not clap. They did not speak loud. Hale closed the ramp with the same care he had opened it. Riley watched the place where the forest had closed and nodded once to no one. The neighbors let their lungs go. On the walk home, Evan and Tom moved under slow curtains of green that drew and redrew the street into a quiet miracle. The rope would be hung in the shed, the lake would freeze, thaw, freeze again. But a new truth had fitted itself into their lives. Sometimes the wild asks, in the only language it owns, and sometimes humans answer with their whole hearts. When they do, the night remembers. If this story touched your heart, stay close. Here on Paw Prints and Stories. We believe some bonds never end. Subscribe for more quiet miracles where compassion meets responsibility, and where the wild teaches us how to listen.